Our guests today are Ambassador Spiros Lambridis and Assistant Secretary General David Catler, joined by the World Affairs Council's board member, John England. Ambassador Spiros Lambridis is the permanent representative of Greece on the North Atlantic Council. He has served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece since '83 and as an officer of the Greek army before becoming a diplomat. Ambassador Lambridis previously served as director of the ministry's Directorate for NATO, Minister and Deputy Permanent Representative of Greece to NATO, and first political counselor to the Permanent Representation of Greece to NATO. Prior to his present role with NATO, he served as the ambassador of Greece to Israel. He has held many prominent roles in Greece's bidding and also in Greece's bidding for and hosting of the 2004 Athens Olympic Games. He has held a variety of other positions within the ministry and earned his bachelor's from the University of Athens and a master's from Boston University. We welcome him. Joining us also is David Catler, who is NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security. He's also the Senior Advisor to the Secretary General for Intelligence and Security Matters. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary General, he was a Senior National and Defense Intelligence official of the U.S. and served as a Senior Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence in multiple roles. He began his career as a Navy service warfare officer and ashore as a military and civilian officer with the Office of Navy Intelligence. He joined the Naval Staff at the Pentagon in 2003 and served as the Deputy Assistant Director of Naval Intelligence for Intelligence Support and Director of Deep Red. He earned his bachelor's from the U.S. Naval Academy and his master's from Georgetown University. He's also a graduate of the National Intelligence University, the U.S. Naval War College, and former senior fellow at MIT. Joining the Assistant Secretary General and the Ambassador, we have our own John England. John is a senior oil and gas client service partner, leading Deloitte's relationships with some of the largest energy companies globally. In his almost 30-year career, John has worked with some of the largest energy companies and is a frequent speaker on energy issues, energy trading, and risk management. You may recognize John from his recent interviews with Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CNBC, CNN, and Bloomberg Radio. Please join me in welcoming our guest today, Ambassador Assistant General John. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mary. And it's a pleasure to be moderating today's session. As a lifelong Houstonian who has worked in the energy industry my whole career, I've always been kind of fascinated by this intersection of geopolitics and energy. So today is just a real treat for me to have the opportunity to speak with our panelists here today. And I know it will be for our audience as well. So I'm just going to dive right in with some questions just to kind of get us going. And I'm going to start with maybe kind of a broad one for you, Ambassador Lambridis. You've worked in NATO as a diplomat starting back in 2004. Since then, you've had a number of different positions at NATO and have been the permanent representative of Greece on the North Atlantic Council more over the last 5 years. So if you look back over this 17-year period you've been involved with NATO, tell me a little bit about how you've seen that evolve and the challenges that its members have faced and changed over the years.
Thank you for the question, Mr. England. But first, let me thank the organizers of this wonderful event. I'm already impressed, first of all, from hearing what exactly the World Affairs Council represents and what Houston represents in the international scene of world politics. I was not surprised, but I'm amazed for the activity and the magnitude of your activities there concerning our field of action. But apart from that, I'm really honored to have you as a moderator and possibly, hopefully, me and David being able to answer to your question. So coming to your first question, how does it affect me? What have I seen during those 17, if I'm not mistaken, years of my experience with NATO, which started from zero practically. When I first came to Brussels in 2004, was by accident. I was about to join the European Union mission, and the last moment they transferred me to NATO, practically not knowing what it's all about, apart from what I had read in the Wikipedia. I'm joking, but I had just a general knowledge of what this organization is about. But through the years, it got me to a point where now I realize that the most important part of my career and my life is dedicated to NATO. So what has changed? What changes have I seen and witnessed during those many, many years, 17 to be exact? First of all, when I entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in the 80s, NATO was comprising 12 members. Later, they became 16, or more or less that period. Probably there were 16 already, but they started with 12 at one point. Then, by the time I got here, the members were 26. Now the members are 30. That means exactly something, and the appeal of NATO to nations across Europe. On the other hand, when I came, I found a Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council that comprised 50 members at the time, of which Russia and the states of the ex-Soviet Union were all members. And I was thrilled. I was actually thrilled to see in the corridors of NATO ex-Soviet, but now independent nation officers with their very lustrous uniforms, the red stripes and the gold and all that, being partners of NATO. And I had wished, naively enough at the time, and not only me, but many among the NATO members, that this relation could continue and should continue. We had so much in common. There are so many challenges in today's world, because that is evolving parallel to NATO. The world is not expecting NATO to evolve and that stays idle. The world evolves rapidly, dazzlingly, I must say. So we were expecting that relation to evolve also. It did evolve, but the other way around. So as much as NATO was progressing, increasing its memberships, and people were attracted by what we represent, our values, our unity, our action, the less it appealed to some others that through these years, they decided they want to turn back more autocratic systems, more revisionist policies, lack of respect for rules-based international order, and all that has to be coped with in a very calm but very decisive way by our organization, NATO, which is, by the way, the most successful alliance in history. It has been alive for 70 years. Hopefully it'll be there as long as it's needed. We will make sure that those values and those principles are the ones guiding us, because that gives us the moral advantage towards any kind of adversary, be it terrorism or any revisionist state. I don't want to name them yet. I'm sure it will come along during our conversation, but there's plenty of them around, unfortunately.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Assistant Secretary Catler, turning to you, you began your current position as Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security for NATO in 2019. But before that, you had a long and impactful career in the U.S. Navy and in U.S. intelligence community. And while a lot of Americans, I think, are familiar with NATO, but maybe not as much with some of the more recent challenges it faces, can you explain to Americans why the alliance is still so crucial to national security and to our global leadership?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. So let me also say, to add to Spyros's comments, I also really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I really appreciated learning about the city of Houston before we began. I mean, it seems like there are almost as many diplomats and diplomatic residencies in Houston as there are here in Brussels from that description. And that, I think, gives you a good sense of the international focus of the city and the direction it's moving in. Look, I started here December 2nd, and I felt like I'd been shot out of a cannon in 2019 because that evening we left for London to go to the Leaders Summit. And in fact, the very next day, I met the Queen in Buckingham Palace and got to go to the summit and see the leaders come together. So it was quite the course in the multilateral nature of the alliance. At the time, 29 members, and then 30 in 2020 when we got to that number. And let me just build on Spyros's point. Look, as a longtime military and civilian career public servant, the values, I think, are critically important. And my sense of it before I came here was that most Americans probably understand the Article 5 issue, this idea that NATO is a military alliance committed to collective security and that an attack on one is an attack on all. And that Article 5 really is a key part of what NATO is, but NATO is also a political alliance. So when it was founded in 1949, with no small push from the United States, frankly, to bring the alliance about, it wasn't about the Soviet Union explicitly. It was actually about values. And what the leaders at that time said was that they had shared values that they wished to protect, that they would stand for, that people that were protected by this alliance had a right to live in peace, that we should protect their freedom, common heritage, and the civilization, that we shared values of democracy, individual liberty, and the sense that the rule of law needed to be supreme. So we did commit to collective defense, but we also committed to peace and security in a larger sense. So I'd argue that from 1949 to 2021, those values have not changed. And I anticipate that when leaders meet at that summit, they will in fact reaffirm those values as the guiding principles for the alliance. Today's challenges simply cannot be solved by one nation by itself. They're just too big. Whether you look at these revanchist, revisionist powers, you look at things like the pandemic, climate change, terrorism, any of that range of things, I think it's become abundantly clear, certainly through the course of last year, that it really does take an orchestration of nations in order to solve those. NATO brings together 30 nations that collectively protect nearly 1 billion people. So in addition to the strength and diversity of that alliance, you're talking about a significant number of the world's population. And the SecGen said, Secretary General Stoltenberg, when he spoke before Congress earlier in 2019, pointed out that strength is measured not just by the size of a nation's economy or its military strength, but also by the numbers of friends it has. And so I think there are many ways in which the U.S. is stronger. But I'd end my opening here with some specific points to those who say, okay, but what does that really mean to me when you talk about that protection? I would point out to you that on September 12th, 2001, the United States actually invoked Article 5. That is the first and only time since NATO was founded in 1949 that Article 5 was invoked. It was invoked for the protection of the United States itself. NATO did contribute AWACS for air surveillance missions, and then NATO forces from this alliance actually have been deployed alongside U.S. military forces in Afghanistan and then Iraq, and even more broadly for the war on terror, most recently against the Islamic State. So there are issues about values that I would argue most of us hold very dear. These are American values just as much as they are NATO values and Greek values and so on around the alliance. And there are many things that the alliance has done that have directly benefited American security over the course of the year since '49.
Yeah, no, that's.
So thanks for the question.
No, it's a great point and I think that probably a lot of Americans aren't aware of, particularly around when Article 5 has been invoked. Thinking about kind of the start of NATO, in the aftermath of World War II, and I think many people view the primary objective was providing a united front against the Soviet Union. We may be optimistic at the end of the Cold War. Maybe I'd ask both of you to comment on why you think a resurgent Russia is such a deep concern for NATO members today, both in terms of its military threats as well as its cyber threats, its attempt to interfere with elections, kind of all of those areas. So whoever would prefer to jump in on that one first.
We're a team, so we both jump in. But
Okay.
in order not to have an anarchy of voices, I will start and then David will finish it off.
Great.
Probably correcting all my mistakes. Your question is very pertinent because one should have thought that after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and after what I mentioned before, the creation of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, things were going for the better. As a matter of fact, practically all, probably except the United States for its own national reasons, all of the members of NATO had substantially diminished their expenditures on defense, thinking that there is no visible threat and the only, let's say, credible threat is not there anymore. That's what we were hoping and that's what we were believing. And then all our dreams were shattered already in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia with false pretext. And then it completed the move in 2014 by the invasion in Crimea and all these incidents that we know at the border regions of Ukraine. It doesn't stop at that, of course. David before mentioned its actions by now in many places around the Mediterranean and further on in the Caucasus and for instance in Syria and Libya, doesn't really stop. So we do see a practical revisionist attitude and an aggressive attitude from Russia. And we're sorry about that because in fact, as David mentioned before, we would like to follow, and we are trying to follow the dual track approach with as much dialogue with Russia as we can to make the world be in a more secure place for us, but also for them. I don't want to go into detail into that, but if you really look at the objective points of power of a nation or state, I would suggest that Russia should be more careful looking at its demographics, at its economic outlook, at its military part, and what the West represents now with the increased expenditure on defense and on technology. In the long run, they're not so, let's say, it's not so obvious that they might win this race. Quite the contrary. So I would suggest that they should be looking for a common European architecture in which they would form part. It would be in our benefit, it would be their benefit, it would make a much safer world. For the time being, we don't see any of that. And unfortunately, the countries that last joined NATO, it's 14 countries, which is a substantial number, which more or less border the line around Russia or Belarus, for instance, they feel the pressure most of all. That's why I can answer to your question, that they can see, they can feel, they can smell the danger and the challenge. So all of us, because that's what NATO is all about, solidarity, in unison, we have to face that challenge. Unfortunately, it's more than a challenge. We mentioned before that China is a challenge. Russia, for the time being, unfortunately, represents a threat, a tangible threat, which we, as NATO, have to preempt and not, let's say, confront it, but dissuade it. And the more self-confident we are, the more dissuasive we are, the less possibilities there is that we have to revert to violence. God forbid we would never do that. I don't think it could be more obvious than that. Russia, at this point, unfortunately, represents a very aggressive factor in the Euro-Atlantic space. David?
Yeah, let me just add a few points, I think, to stitch some things together. And I think Spiros was referring to the conversation we had with the mayor's office right before this began, so we got the introduction to Houston.
Yeah, we have so many discussions
yeah,
between ourselves.
We talk all the time.
All those.
So just a couple things. First, I go back to your question and say, well, what's wrong with a strong, self-confident Russia? Well, if Russia was responsible, if Russia wasn't a revisionist power, if Russia wasn't authoritarian domestically, look, the Russian people deserve a nation that takes care of their interests and has a good social contract with them, same as everyone else does that lives in every other nation. But they simply don't have that. They don't have those freedoms, and their nation doesn't always behave responsibly on the international stage. As Spiros said, NATO has two main designated threats. Russia is one and terrorism is the other. We have a lot of challenges that we also look at, but those are the two main threats. Russia has engaged in a significant military buildup over the last several years. They have essentially built a reinforced a wall, if you will, almost of military power from the high north down through the Baltics, through Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea, down to occupied, illegally annexed Crimea in the Black Sea, Syria in the Middle East, and then around now increasingly through North Africa. And sadly, they've also engaged in a wider pattern of destabilizing behavior. Disinformation and propaganda domestically and internationally, election interference in Europe, in America also, significant cyber attacks. They've used chemical weapons against political opponents. They've engaged in sabotage in European states, conducted assassinations there as well in recent years. And we see their destabilizing effect in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Now, Spiros said NATO does maintain a dual-track approach to Russia, though. So deterrence and defense, I think, is the most obvious response to what I just listed. But we also do seek to also maintain a meaningful dialogue. We have a NATO-Russia Council that we have sought to engage Russia in, and sadly, in recent months and years, they have not accepted that invitation to come in and exercise that dialogue, but nonetheless, it's available. The alliance has begun its biggest reinforcement of collective defense in a generation. Military spending, defense spending is up, even notwithstanding COVID, to meet the 2% commitment from the Wales Summit. We've increased our counter-hybrid and cyber defenses. So counter-hybrid, if it's a term of art, but really to get at this special forces, little green men, intelligence service, illegal activity, the disinformation and misinformation, election interference, all of those things. So things that we can do to help NATO members and partners reinforce themselves and secure their civil societies against those attacks. We've improved our cyber defenses. We've created an intelligence and security division. We've increased the amount of intelligence and other information sharing within the alliance. And we've helped strengthen both allied and partner capabilities to better defend against the threat that Russia poses.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's helpful to understand both the range of threat there is, and as well as the various responses. Because again, I think we tend to think only about the military buildup and response, and not some of the other things. Maybe switching gears a little bit. So as we go through and as we deal with the economic upheaval and the disruption that's come from the COVID pandemic, I think one thing it highlighted really across the board was risks around trade and economic stability, and particularly around supply chains. So curious to talk to you and get a sense of what NATO and its members are doing to develop or strengthen existing supply chains and make kind of more resilient trade practices among its members.
Yeah. So I'll start. We're actually doing a lot of things. I think you're going to see a lot of effort from us on resilience. I think will be the key term to describe all of this work. And I'm confident here leaders will take this up during the summit as well. Resilience really our first line of defense, and that underpins our ability to defend each other. I would emphasize to you that I'm not just referring to military resilience, but also domestic societal resilience. So we're very mindful not just of the things we saw during COVID, but I'd also point you to the Colonial Pipeline hack, some of the issues there, frankly, about supply chain and energy security as well. So NATO is working to set minimum standards for resilience for allies. That's going to help us measure preparedness. We have reviewed critical infrastructure. We'll continue to review critical infrastructure across the alliance and to improve coordination between allies. In the area of energy security, I think you're going to hear us talk about the need to have stable, reliable supplies, diversification of routes, suppliers, and resource types. Interconnectivity is critical, both having it so that you have that diversity, but also understanding where you have interconnectivity so that if your nation, your suppliers are attacked in some way or could be threatened or leveraged in some way, that all of those interdependencies are also known. Interdependency is a good thing. Overdependency is not a good thing. So I think really understanding how all that comes together is really important to us. You got to remember, too, that a lot of this is really a national responsibility. And it's not NATO's role to dictate to the United States or to Greece or any of the other allies what they must do domestically, politically, economically in this space. And yet leaders of the nations have already agreed within the NATO context that having these common standards can improve common situational awareness. We could share lessons learned. And then the alliance can do the things politically and militarily that can be agreed across that group of 30 nations to lift that common baseline, even while respecting the individual state sovereignty. Spears.
I don't think I have anything to add to what David very eloquently presented as our number one must perhaps, which is the societal resilience. This is not about the military. We live in a world that everything that happens is directly, immediately known or distortedly known to every individual around our democracies. Therefore, what goes around as a fact or as a rumor has quite a big impression and a big effect on how societies react. We have to coordinate that, as David said, so that the overall resilience of a society, not only its military, for instance, in a pandemic like COVID, where we had scenes of panic, scenes of social inobedience, fatigue of people, fine. But that was first seen a pandemic that hasn't hit the world since the Spanish flu. That was an exception. What we might be seeing in the future would be probably, hopefully not, but probably massive hybrid or cyber attacks in which the society as a whole, the pipeline, for instance, the colonial pipeline, things like that, or the world trade, could be affected. There we need societies, democratic societies, not autocratic societies, that things are imposed on them to respect, that they themselves, the citizens, as democratic thinking citizens, decide that they have to side with the overall security of our world. Otherwise, there will be a lot of problems. And we haven't mentioned so far the issue, because it has subsided, luckily, over the last years, but it's still there, the question of fundamentalist terrorism. That the last decade, for instance, in Europe caused major social disruption, either by hideous and heinous terrorist act that caused a lot of casualties, or by disseminating a sort of suspicion and distrust among communities in societies that are multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and we cannot afford to have that. So we need a society that can be robust against all these challenges. You touched, let's say, peripherally the question of energy security. I'm sure we'll come back to that because there are a lot of, David already mentioned them, interconnectivity, less dependence from one source, variety of sources, variety of places where you get the LNG, for instance, or other sorts of energy. I will come back to that, I'm sure.
Well, in fact, let's go to that now, if we could. I mean, maybe just to go a little deeper on the topic of energy security. Obviously, the Russian energy exports, in particular Russian gas, into Europe has continued to be, pose a challenge, I think. And so, just curious, your thoughts around, what is NATO doing to help its members establish really more. We often talk about energy independence. I think it's more about energy security than it is independence, right? I struggle with the term when people talk about U.S. energy independence. I think we're not really worried about if we're importing gas from Canada, because I don't see a big security risk there. But so security is the key to the whole thing. So just curious your thoughts about what the NATO members are doing, can do to help increase that security.
You want to take this?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in first, I guess, just to amplify some of the points I made, but with this focus. So at the NATO headquarters level, we have created a small team within one of my counterpart divisions for emerging security challenges focused specifically on energy security. And they have worked with the allies to come up with an energy security strategy and some capabilities then to assist in the things I mentioned, the standard setting, the critical infrastructure analysis, and those sorts of things. NATO also conducts exercises to test some of these things, now mostly tabletops and other types of exercises, but exercises nonetheless, so that we can game out what the implications are of an energy security challenge. We, again, set standards, share best practices. There are also NATO military operations that are conducted to help protect sea lanes. And that's done. We do counter-piracy missions. We also do patrols in the East Med. We do all sorts of things there for that. And overall, I should say, too, part of that energy security strategy is also take a look at how our militaries can be more efficient. So to set standards for fuel consumption, types of fuels that should be used for cleanliness, for environmental protection, security, and that sort of thing, but also to save resources and enhance sustainability. And I just emphasize, and then turn back to Spiros, too, that a lot of this interdisciplinary work that's done here is also helpful in the same space. So the cyber protections, the counter-hybrid protections, the intelligence and security information exchange, and that sort of thing are also helpful collectively to better understand and to assist the allies and partners in protecting their energy.
Sure.
Well, I couldn't match with David on the technical part of it, because obviously he's much better informed and he's much more apt to this kind of discussion. But that's my specialty, being a little provocative on this. Energy and sources of energy. Let me tell you this. For the last 10 years at least, the relations between Russia and all of the allies that are dependent practically entirely on Russia alone, at least have been, for their natural gas or their petrol, have been deteriorating. Nevertheless, Russia never shut one source of energy to any of these countries throughout the worst moments of crisis. Is that because it's a benevolent power? Naturally, that's what they're going to say, that despite what you're saying about us, we never close the tap, we never let anyone freeze. Well, the answer could be, however, referring to what I said before, if they look at the outlook of their economy in general, if they stop providing gas and petrol to the West, what other kind of income sources do they really have? So it's probably more of a necessity for them to export the oil and the gas. But despite that, should we be relying on that? God, no. That's exactly why, as David said, we are diversifying our sources. We're trying alternative means of energy as a whole, but that's not for tomorrow, of course. We, as I was surprised to hear before, Texas itself, despite its production, it's 20% self-sufficient in alternative energy sources, which is magnificent. We in Europe are doing our best. The European Union is doing, and the Commission is doing an excellent job, and we have a very ambitious plan that by the year 2050, practically we have nothing to do with fossil energy sources. That's perhaps too ambitious, but that's a reality. We are moving to that direction. Of course, when we're talking about generally energy, there are points of let's say, troubling all of us on what that might imply in terms of income, not for a company, but for entire states or for peoples living in those states, sometimes measuring the many, many millions. What kind of income will they have? How this change is going to affect their lives? Secondly, as David said, cyber implication of the turning to alternative means of energy. Everything will be digitalized when we go to other sources of energy, hydrogen, etc. That's not going to be easy to tackle cyber warfare wise. And there comes also the threats and the challenges from not so benign states or non-state actors. And the third question is, okay, we stop on fossil material for energy. We don't rely on them. We use alternative means of energy. Fine, electric cars, all these nice things. Do we realize what kind of alternative, very rare materials we need to produce all that kind of thing? And to be more provocative, do we know who owns or who at least controls at least 80% of all those rare materials, nickel and lithium and all that, in the world market? There is a name for that, China. So we have to be very, very careful, very, as David said, very pragmatic in NATO, how to consolidate the security aspects of the energy field in general, by diversification, by gradual adjustment, and also by interconnecting those sources in an efficient way.
No, it's a great point. I think as people look to new energy sources and renewable energy, it's important to understand some of the other supply chain challenges that will cause and the potential security issues around that. So that's a great point. We're getting a lot of good questions from the audience, so I'm gonna start picking out a few of those to try to get through as many as we can here. Let me just tee up one here. So from Victor, he asked the question: what is the single largest threat NATO visualizes that might be disruptive to energy security globally, and what plans exist to neutralize that threat? What do you want to?
Hey, Ghostbuster of energy problems. What is your answer to that?
Well, the largest threat NATO visualizes, I think that it's the kind of current scenario, which is that you have a revisionist Russia that continues to seek to use energy supplies as a leverage point, in both civilian senses and in military senses, because the disruption of energy supply has a debilitating effect on a wide range of societal issues. I'm going to go back and say it is true that they've never actually turned it off. But if you just take the Ukrainian case, right, because we get this question of, okay, but what have they actually done? Look, in 2014, they increased the prices of Ukrainian gas, increased the price of gas to Ukraine to put extra strain on Kiev and the Ukrainians. They provided energy to Ukrainian separatists and denied energy to Ukraine itself. And they expropriated, it's a fancy word for stole, Ukrainian energy infrastructure and assets when they illegally occupied and annexed Crimea. They did threaten, in fact, in June of 2014 to cut off Ukraine altogether if they didn't pay in advance. Generally speaking, they try to keep nations dependent on Russian energy supplies. Mm-hmm. So you just have to have the threat in being. You say, I could turn it off, and you're drawing the great majority of your energy from us, whether current or on projected energy infrastructure. A lot of political and economic leverage then derived, a lot of disinformation regarding that status, a little scare factor, I think, domestically and politically to get nations to agree to these contracts to use Russian energy providers. And they have, in fact, conducted cyber attacks on energy assets in Poland, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and also against partners in Ukraine and Georgia. And when these energy attacks occur, it's not just focused on the energy system and energy infrastructure, as you'd imagine in Houston, but also on electrical power distribution. And when that happens, if you take the Georgia case, for example, you're turning off electricity in a city where people are in hospitals. They're reliant on power for respirators or for other critical care. I mean, frankly, it could be under the knife while the power is cut off, and it's just unconscionable, to have that be the effect. So it needn't be a large-scale denial of gas or or liquid oil, although that could happen. But it's also energy supply and energy distribution in a more conventional sense that we're concerned about when we look at this resilience issue.
Yeah.
I would just take the last point that David made. Indeed, they don't have to turn off the tap. I mean, actually, they have never done. They might have threatened, but that's part exactly of the hybrid warfare. You can threaten someone to coerce him to do whatever you want him to do by saying, I might do that. And apart from that, indeed, that's what I would come to. The question of cyber attacks, that is something that we have to look very seriously in, because, as I said before, the more we rely on alternative sources of energy, the cyber effect of an attack would be substantially increased. Everything will be digitalized, and that would make us extremely vulnerable to those that do not think in the same way of values and principles that we said we support before, and we actually do. They don't. They prove it on a daily basis. Actually, they proved it yesterday again, but we're not there now with this sort of official state hijacking, if I can call it terrorism as well, in the middle of European airspace, which is unheard of. They down, I mean, the Belarusian incident that everybody has heard about. They downed the plane that was coming from Athens to Vilnius on a false bomb and pretext of a false bomb scare, which is fine. I mean, if the plane had left with all the passengers and the crew again, it would be just one hoax, one incident, that one of the many that happen around Europe every other day. But the fact is that the plane took off some hours later, minus some passengers. And those passengers are dissidents of the Lukashenko regime, and they're being under, let's say, questioning at this time, which is not exactly very beneficial to their health. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, no, that's another question, and this is kind of along the lines you mentioned Ukraine. The question from Irina is, why does NATO not consider membership for Georgia and Ukraine to strengthen them and weaken the Russians' regional interest in the Caucasus?
It's more political. Should I start?
Why don't you start?
Take it off?
Yeah.
Well, that is a question that is being hovering around the air of NATO and the international scene for many years now. Let's see what are the steps for a country to become a NATO member. First of all, it's part of our open door policy, and it's there. And we have pledged many years ago in a summit that Georgia and Ukraine, if they want to join NATO, they're free to do so. The steps to follow are there. There are procedures, and everyone is being admitted on its own merits. There are no favors. There are no denials. There's a procedure. It's obvious from the moment one country enters NATO, it benefits the full advantages of a NATO membership. If you look at the politics of the region, the internal situation in both countries, what they went through over the last years, there were several stages where a premature, let's say, full membership would cause themselves troubles, let alone the overall balance in the alliance. And there's no question, there's no reason to beat around the bush that a full membership at this stage of Georgia and Ukraine in NATO would provoke a full reaction from Russia. Whether we're ready to take it on or not, probably it's better, as I said before, to deter instead of countering an actual full-fledged war. I'm not saying that this would cause a war, but one has to see the steps and the possibilities at every, let's say, stop of the way. We have had 10 new members over the last years. I think we have completed a cycle. Obviously, Georgia and the Ukraine are in the list for future membership. They have expressly said that they want to become members. There's a possibility that this will happen in the near, let's say, future, not tomorrow, but this is not something to happen 2 centuries from now. It's happening, but it takes its time and its steps so that everything is done in a reasonable way.
Yeah, Spiros touched on the open door policy, and that is clearly available. Allies stand by the decisions that, as Spiros said, were taken at the Bucharest summit, which is that means in practical terms that Ukraine and Georgia both have a path to membership, but there are steps, as Spiros said, that they have to go through. But I mean, let's cut to the chase. I think you saw and heard during this most recent crisis between Russia and Ukraine, NATO stands with Ukraine. The NATO alliance has strengthened Ukraine's capabilities. Many member nations have provided not just training, but also capabilities to their armed forces. NATO supports Ukraine's reform agenda that increases their resilience. It also, frankly, brings Ukraine closer to NATO. And that support for Ukraine is unwavering. we support their sovereignty and their territorial integrity. So it didn't matter, frankly, that they didn't have membership in this most recent crisis. I think NATO came out very clearly, very strongly, and very early in support of Ukrainian sovereignty, and I think that mattered.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Question for you. You early on, both of you touched on the values of NATO and the importance of values to NATO. And so one of the questions we had from Vic was, can you expand a little bit on what are those values, and is there a mission actually to extend those values even beyond the NATO members?
How do you want to take it?
Well,
We're both jumping in.
I'll start with the basics, and then I guess I'll leave Spiros the political pieces of it. Look, the values are ensconced in the Washington Treaty, which in effect serves as NATO's charter. So that the founding treaty I referred to earlier from 1949. Again, just to go back and touch on them. So those 12 alliance members, and now all 30, have agreed that means that we seek to live in peace. We protect freedom, our common heritage and civilization, that we value democracy, individual liberty, and respect for the rule of law, and that we carry that out through collective defense as a guarantee of peace and security. Those are the values of the alliance. So essentially, democracy and freedom, sovereignty, and that right of self-determination is really what the alliance was based on and stands for.
Right, absolutely. And the second part of your question was of the person that asked the question, which is a very pertinent question, is how could NATO extend those values outside NATO? Well, we can't force anyone to abide by those values. We're sure that our 30 members, at least, they abide by them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be members of NATO. But what we do also with partnerships, and that's exactly what I mentioned before in this process of the open door, that everyone is being judged according to its own merits, is exactly how loyal can they be, provenly, vis-a-vis those values. It's not if they have strong enough armies or their economy can withstand the obligations that they have as future NATO members, but it's how close are they to those values. And apart from that, what NATO tries to do, and it's part of the NATO 2030 process, is a whole chapter on it, is to declare openly that we want to live, and we want to live in a world that is abiding by rules, that it's an international order that is being ruled by values and by specific international law regulations. We don't want countries to run rogue around neglecting their obligations vis-a-vis humanity, vis-a-vis their obligations to the UN, and vis-a-vis the application of international law. That's what rules our actions, and whoever does not comply by that is problematic. And I don't want to extend my intervention in that particular issue, but there are countries that are very close to our heart, probably also members of international organizations, either the United Nations for sure, or probably NATO, that in the last years saw a total disrespect for some aspects of international law. That cannot be accepted. That has been a reason for, let's say, in-depth discussion in NATO itself, and that's to the credit of our Secretary General, that is not shying away from difficult questions, even when it concerns member states that do not really comply fully with those basic elements of values and principles that David just mentioned. These are carved in stone in Washington. And if they are not being respected, then we have no real reason for existing as an alliance.
Good point. Another question that's come in is from it's Anastasia. There's possible cooperation between Turkey with Russia, and what are the concerns of the U.S. and the rest of NATO? So I don't know, perhaps Assistant Secretary Catler, would you want to try to address that one?
Yeah, the question was mentioning the word United States, so I give it to you. I promised myself I won't go into bilateral issues, but I can say anything about it.
Yeah, I guess I'll just start, and I'll be brief and say that, well, first let me say, when I work here, I work for NATO, not for the U.S. So I'll say from a NATO perspective, the concern is ensuring that we're not inviting problems within the alliance in terms of intelligence and security risks, and undermining the political and military solidarity within the alliance. So the question really becomes, as I've just covered, Russia is one of the two main threats that the alliance at 30 has agreed it faces. That said, there's a need to maintain a dialogue track as well, in that dual track approach. So individual members and the alliance then have to take their decisions about what they wish and do not wish to do as they move forward. That's probably the best political statement I can make. But then over to you.
Diplomatic maneuver by David, a non-diplomat. Me being serving as a NATO functionary, but not for NATO, but for Greece, I can be more blunt. But I will not, of course, attack any country, any member state, and I will not use this forum to badmouth one very dear to us ally. But the fact and what the question is referring to is that there is an obvious cooperation in various fields between Russia, as you mentioned, and one ally, which is Turkey, in several fields. That includes Libya, that includes Syria, Libya to a lesser extent, but in fact on the ground, their, let's say, militias or protégés were next to each other. Nobody fired at each other ever. So I'm not talking about open cooperation, but there is certainly a collusion of interest there. It's much more open and much more obvious in what is happening in Syria. And recently it is still very open and very obvious in what is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. They're patrolling together. As David said, its ally is also an independent state and is judging its own foreign policy moves and actions by its own, let's say, priorities. It's for the rest of us or for the general public to judge for itself if that is good, positive, or negative. And as for more details on what exactly that cooperation implies in places like Idlib, for instance, where the last vestiges of ISIS are hiding behind those countries that you just mentioned, it's better to direct the question to Ankara and Moscow.
Thanks. Another, I thought, really interesting question came in. This was from Spencer. It says, considering Article 5, does it apply only to overt military threats, or can it include cyber and political interference from Russia against NATO members?
This is an excellent question, and one of the biggest challenges that we face in modern warfare when you talk about, use a technical term, I guess, what could trigger an Article 5, and what justifies it. There are procedures to invoke Article 5. The article itself obviously derived from the Washington Treaty, which itself is very short and worth a read and happens to be on the NATO website. So you can check that out and the values and all these articles. Leaders decided in recent years, I think in 2017, that in fact a cyber attack could
18, I think.
Yeah, 17, 18 could trigger an Article 5. There may be other domains potentially that leaders would wish to take a look at and reach similar conclusions, space, and then there may be other forms of warfare that they would look at. The challenge really, I think, is that an Article 5 scenario, a direct attack on an ally in a conventional sense, usually is fairly overt and pretty easy to understand and characterize. A sub-Article 5 issue is much, much more challenging. So if you take a hybrid attack like internal destabilization, let's say there's an attempted coup and a nation comes forward, a member comes forward and asks for an Article 5, a cyber attack that has a devastating domestic effect, even if it spills over and has a regional effect, we will immediately have issues to resolve, and very quickly, I think, about correct attribution. Who was it? What was the motivation? Can we agree on that? This is why cyber is such a challenge here. An intelligence service operation that used another term of ours, a false flag, where it's conducted by one party but looks like another, right? It's deliberately deceptive in its execution and its very construct. That could be quite challenging. And NATO as an alliance works on consensus. So it's not just that there are 30 members and we talk about solidarity. What it means in practice is that they take action based on consensus at 30, meaning that they all agree that an issue is an issue. They debate the options in both a political and a military sense, and then they reach a decision and cooperative action is taken. And I think it's obvious that the more confused the situation, and especially by design in some of these domains like cyber, the more difficult it will be to quickly gather the proper information. I mean, it's why I love my job so much, frankly, but why it's so challenging to gather the right information, draw the right conclusions, issue assessments, and then enable Spiros and the other perm reps and the military representatives in the military committee to have those debates and reach that consensus.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Absolutely, absolutely correct analysis. That's what happens. Before the Article 5, however, there is, thank God there is, and our forefathers were very wise in thinking of all that. There's an Article 4 calling for extensive discussions before invoking Article 5. And there, the NAC, also again, with consensus, will analyze the magnitude, the attribution, and the reaction to such an action. But let me speak with examples, for instance, that might justify the question of, a very good question, by the way, of the person in the audience, and perhaps give the picture of how Article 5 could be invoked, even with not a military action. A few days ago, there was a wave of, deliberate wave, by the way, and it was not attributed, but accepted by the country that did it, of illegal immigrants going through Ceuta in the Spanish enclave in North Africa. And the government of Morocco openly said that we did that deliberately. We withdrew our police forces to show our discontent to Spain for harboring the leader of Polisario, the independentist movement in Western Sahara. And it was just a move for a few days. Can you imagine, can the public imagine, if that thing is being transposed in another area, let's say Libya, which is not very well-governed state at the moment. Hopefully by next year, when they will have a stable government, they will be more able to control this kind of flows. And we have a flow, God forbid, of 50,000 per day to Lampedusa, Italy, which is a very small island, but a deliberate one, for instance, so that they can blackmail the Italian government, the European Union. I'm not talking about the government of Libya, someone, a non-state actor, but that could constitute a real attack on the sovereign soil of one member state of the alliance and the European Union. I don't say that immediately that would invoke Article 5, but certainly it could justify the invocation of Article 4 to see what measures we can take, even arriving at the point of Article 5. The weaponization of mass migratory movement is something we see increasingly happening in our region, in the Mediterranean, in the Aegean, and that is something we have to be very careful about, because indeed that at one point might invoke an Article 5.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the different forms that these threats can take in today's world. So, well, unfortunately, I think we're about up on time. It's been just an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I wish we could go longer. But first of all, just want to thank the ambassador and the assistant secretary. Just great discussion, and really appreciate your time today. I'd also like to say thank you again to our event partners, the Public Diplomacy Division of Nato, and the World Affairs Council of America, as well as obviously the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, which I'm a part. So just thank you all for putting on, helping us put together such a great show today. Upcoming events that people might be interested in: on June 10th, Ben Rhodes, who is the President Obama's chief speechwriter, will be on virtually, and then on June 17th, Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense and the former Director of the CIA, will be live, I believe, but that's actually a live event again. So great to see those coming back as well. So again, you can find all of those on the World Affairs Council of Houston website. So thanks again to everybody, and have a great rest of the day.